We'd like to thank the Cloud Native Computing Foundation for sponsoring our podcast from CloudNativeCon in Seattle. Inspired by internet-scale computing, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation advances the development of cloud-native technology and services by creating a new set of common container technologies informed by technical merit and end-user value. You can learn more about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation at cncf.io. Hey, it's Alex Williams, the new stack here at KubeCon/Cloud Native Day. And with us right now is Dan Kohn, the Executive Director of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and Chris Aniszczyk. And Chris leads OCI, which is the Open Compute Initiative.
Container Initiative.
I mix that up all the time. Yep. Open Container Initiative. So, Dan, this is your event, and it's jam-packed, and you sold out, and over, there's more sponsors than you could have. Why? What's going on?
Well, I hate to reference the hype curve and maybe curse us here, but we're definitely not in the trough of disillusionment quite yet. This is still riding up the side of the hype curve, and folks are incredibly excited about containers. Yeah. And so this is our first CloudNativeCon event,
right,
where we're pulling in KubeCon, Prometheus, Open Tracing, and now FluentD communities, and just hopefully fostering a lot of interaction and kind of positive cross-pollination between different groups.
So I have a theory about this, and so perhaps we could talk about it. And so my theory is that things like Docker, things like Kubernetes are symbolic. They're also very measurable, and they're very constructive type projects, but they're very symbolic of scale-out ecosystems, right? And building scale-out ecosystems. And not just building them now, but managing them as well, right? And so as we're starting, and as so more companies really are, I think that seems to be the driver that we see, is like companies want to build scale-out ecosystems, right? That's what they're trying to do. They know they have to do it. They're just grasping for any kind of information that they could possibly get around it. And for years, it's just been done very much in kind of an isolated clusters, right? There'd be a Twitter, right? Facebook. There'd be LinkedIn. There'd be companies maybe like Netflix, on the enterprise level, like Netflix or even Disney, right? We're doing these things, but it was now we're starting to see almost like this, now the pieces are connecting, and scale out is what we're trying to do, because really there's no choice.
I think of this space as, what's the meta-narrative that CNCF is trying to tell about computing and cloud computing? And it's that the smart way to build modern applications is on a cloud-native platform.
Yeah.
And, there's a specific subtleties to that, which is we're not necessarily saying that every legacy application you have should be ported over to Kubernetes in the next month or two. And we're not... certainly greenfield or looking at how you can transition brownfield. And what story are we trying to avoid is that, this stuff is all so new and so scary that I'm just going to do nothing and just sit around for a couple years. Because for all of our partners and the projects and everything else, that would be a bad thing. And so I think one of the real messages for a conference like this is just around momentum, and saying that folks making these deployment decisions are not going off on their own into a spooky neighborhood, that this is where a ton of extremely smart, well-informed, connected companies and users are going, and that you can come along for the ride.
Okay, great. So let's get a level set here. So Chris, for people out there who may not be familiar with OCI, tell us what OCI is. And I think we have a sense from what Dan's talking about what CNCF does, but perhaps you could just say it more. You could just say kind of like in one sentence or two. What is OCI and what is CNCF, and what is it? And then perhaps each of you could talk to the symbiosis between the two, because I know they're very separate foundations, but there's also some. There's always some relationship there.
So I'll kind of start with CNCF. The whole cloud native thing is all about microservices that essentially are dynamically scheduled, that run on top of containers, right? And so that's basically it when we think cloud native, and all the technology within CNCF is basically around that kind of mission. OCI is really concerned about the container aspect, right? Defining a standard way that your containers are truly portable and will run on all the different cloud providers, all the different container engines out there. And so OCI is very narrowly in scope in standardizing exactly how a container is kind of executed, and also how the actually image format layout looks like. And so that's completely it. So a very simple, narrowly scoped project that other projects like Kubernetes with CNCF, Cloud Foundry, and so on will adopt what OCI produces.
Okay. Is there any different take you would have on that? Or is it similar, or what?
I had a journalist in Berlin asked me our relationship with CNCF's relationship with OCI. Chris wasn't there, and so I just quickly answered, "We're going to crush them under our heel." And the Linux Foundation PR guy, who was sort of sitting there checking his email, just like lunged out of his chair. I'm like, "No, joking." But no, it is very symbiotic, and the container. Reference architecture, the container platform, is just one piece of the CNCF stack. It so happens that it's arguably the most important piece. I think of in terms of, there's this famous diagram, the IP hourglass, that helps explain some of the success of the internet. And the idea is that everybody agreed on IP, the internet protocol, and then right above it you just have a couple small options of TCP, UDP. That somewhat is analogous to the orchestration platforms that there's just 4 open source ones right now: Kubernetes, Docker Swarm, Nomad, and Mesos. And then above that, it allows this incredible plethora of different options. And the same thing below, that you just have a relatively small number, but of hardware and cloud platforms that you can live on. But the magical piece is that everybody agrees on IP as your interoperability layer. Well, you can imagine a similar architecture for cloud native, where OCI is really defining that key interoperability point that allows the ecosystem to have just a myriad of options above and below.
And there was this funny tweet from Kelsey recently, Hightower, around containers should be boring, right? And we should all standardize on a specific approach, and it's really where the exciting level is really applications. That's what developers really care about at the end of the day. So OCI is doing its best to standardize on the container bits.
Right. So is that the hourglass then analogy with the image format and the runtime? Yeah.
They're definitely the most critical pieces. There's some other interesting aspects around OCI, around distribution and other things that will evolve after 1.0. But we need to kind of agree on how to store containers, how they're laid out, and how we run them, and keep that as standard as possible, so it could be reused by everyone. So we don't fight about that, and instead innovate on the level above.
So now we're approaching 1.0 for the image format and the runtime.
Yep.
How close are we?
We're probably, I would say, a month or two is probably a good estimate. We're essentially RC2 for both, or 1.0 RC2 for both the image spec and runtime spec. According to how the OCI governance works, once we get to RC3, which would happen in a week or two, the OCI development community could officially call for a vote to stamp it as a 1.0. We're close, but you never know. Things pop up, as more people play around, things may issues. But I'm pretty confident we'll get there in a month or two. It
was announced at DockerCon in 2015, right? The OCI?
It's June. I think it was June 2015. The effort was officially announced, and later that year we kind of got our stuff together, and all these little governance things take a while to shake out.
it's taken a long time to get to 1.0. Is there a reason why?
If you look at OCI as a standard, remember, right? You know, specifications, implementation, so on. For standard, I'd argue it's pretty fast moving. If you look at other standards out there, work in the W3, OASIS, and so on, they take a long time. So a year to come out with a 1.0 is not so shabby in my opinion.
So CNCF is a different kind of an animal, and now you are treating it almost seeming like, you announced a reference architecture kind of initiative. You're taking on different types of projects. You announced FluentD today.
Yep.
You have had open tracing as part of joining the CNCF. Tell us about that course at CNCF.
Sure. I think the big difference is that unlike OCI, we're not trying to define something new. We're actually going out into the world and saying, what are the already successful projects
you're consuming it
that have already achieved some traction with our end user base and that our vendors are excited about, and then going to them and saying, hey, you should consider getting hosted at CNCF because you're not really having to give up anything. It's still your project. You're still the committer. You can still use your current processes, but we're going to add in all of this other value on top of it. And part of that is the trying to tell a cohesive story about a stack and a set of stacks that can meet customers' needs. And so it's sort of not surprising that stuff can just happen faster out there because we can go find really successful projects and hopefully make them even more successful. And I think FluentD is a great example of that, where this is not just sort of a couple people who have this idea of, maybe it would be nice to have, a logging architecture. And
So what is FluentD? Tell us what it is, and why did you adopt it now as a priority in terms of the project list?
Yeah, sure. So, FluentD is simply, you could view it as kind of a system to aggregate logs from disparate sources. So there's different, things that emit logs, and you want to kind of aggregate them into one place. So in theory, that's just how it works. It's been a healthy project externally, like Google Cloud GCP has taken advantage of FluentD. They have something like 2,000 companies or something playing with it. So it just solves a very important problem around log aggregation, which pretty much everyone has to deal with because you're using disparate components in your infrastructure to begin with. So glad to have them on board.
I had mentioned in my keynote Heroku as having really pioneered some critical concepts in PaaS and DevOps, and FluentD has a great opening quote, has a great quote from the Heroku founder Adam Wiggins. I think that's it, something like that, where he talks about this idea of logs as streams as opposed to logs as files.
Right.
And that's a really critical concept in computing, where you don't want to trust the file system. You don't want to write to it and then find that that container crashed before you were ever able to process it. You want to emit these streams with a time attached to it, and then be able to process them in a centralized way, and then also potentially send them off to lots of different sources for different kinds of analysis. And FluentD is just used by tons of different folks today, and I think the statistic is that they have like 300 different connection points for different kinds of containers and stacks and projects and such. So we think it can get better. We're also looking to give it some help, and we would love to feature some of the ways people are using it that are more innovative. But we're thrilled to have it on board.
It reminds me of these. And there's seems to be some theme among these different projects. Open tracing, has obviously been developed by Ben Sigelman, who we actually just talked to, and he talked about its history, from Dapper and how it evolved, from single instance environments to these distributed environments. And when we talk to other people too, we talked to the people over at Apparetto and how they kind of treat things, and they're thinking of really the metadata there, really that the metadata really becomes the story, almost becomes that theme that you're starting to see, but it has different, there's different stories to tell with that data. And I don't know if that's something that you guys would agree with, but it seems like that there's some corollary there in the projects that we see.
There's a tweet that I love. I forget who wrote it, that in the cloud native world, debugging any problem becomes as difficult as a murder mystery.
Yeah.
And that's a problem if it's the case. And I do think of both open tracing and FluentD as being somewhat of the solution to that, to say that you need a lot of information about the different
It's not
parts.
as simple as it was the professor with the candlestick.
Yes, exactly.
There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, you want to just have it, be able to just click in and say, professor with the candlestick.
You need to have
that's
the DNA evidence.
Well, but you ideally would like your tracing platform to analyze it for you and be able to tell you where the problem is.
Right.
And so that's an aspiration. But I do think a lot of what we're doing is trying to put together some of those best practices and show off how some of the best companies are making use of it today.
Is my analogy too simple? Is it?
It works. It's it's funny because I never thought of it that way. But yeah, like I remember, my time, my time at Twitter, we had Zipkin, for example, being able to trace down to, your all the different requests made for your service, and being able to see, the query I used to hit the database was basically the laggard, in the request. So I need to go optimize this, and then you go fix the problem. So it's, anytime you have a bunch of different services. Tracing is critical to really understand how to improve things and fix things. Otherwise, it's a bit of a nightmare.
So tell us about this reference architecture and why. What's the roots behind that?
The root was actually pretty simple, and it's a good inspiration for getting something approved, which is that in the CNCF charter that was put together last December, there's a quick diagram that was written up, and no one on the TOC liked the diagram. And so that didn't necessarily mean that they immediately agreed on what was
in the diagram they disagreed with.
It's the whole thing about API surfaces.
Yeah, it was very simplistic. It was like buried in the Schedule A. Not many people looked at it anyway, and it was in dire need of an update. It didn't link also technologies to, which is it didn't slot technologies in the right section either. So
I think there's also just a not invented here, and I mean these are folks who wanted to put their stamp on it, and that's fine. I mean I respect their opinion, and it is kind of amazing. Well, I guess we're still a vote or two short, but we're very close.
We're close
to getting that approved. And
if Alexis, you're listening to this, everyone's waiting.
We're waiting for that. We're waiting for that +1. But I think the partnership with Redpoint is definitely interesting. So maybe Dan can talk a little bit about.
And so that was just a nice follow-up for this, and this was a connection that Alexis put together. Alexis Richardson from Weaveworks, who's the head of our chairperson of our technical oversight committee. But we consider a big job of what we're doing at CNCF to be thought leadership and market leadership. And I think you need to go in just realizing that any diagram you create is going to be wrong in some ways, and that people are going to criticize it, and that there's no perfect story here, but that it is really useful. When I was a venture capitalist in 2000, I would have all of these companies come in and talk about how they're just transforming this, and they're going to be the central thing in this, and I didn't even have the terminology for it, but the elevator pitch of I'm the Uber for dog walking, which, of course, it's a company funded and everything, but which is, yes, it's super limited, but it's just taxonomy is a really useful exercise. And because then you can start asking the more in-depth questions of, how do you compare to the other options? Why? What's your interoperability on the layers above and below, and all the other pieces of it? And the Redpoint folks have been fantastic to work with on it, and we're actually kind of aspirational here, but we have an idea for a real open source project behind this, where it's not just a PDF or a ping, but will actually be a website that you can go to and hover over, and then what we'd like to do is to try and remove a little bit of the judgment of what projects get included or not based on how many stars they have, or if they're companies, how much funding they have, and we haven't set all those rules up, but we have some ideas for them, and we're really excited to have people take a look. And in fact, right after my keynote, I had over a dozen issues opened of all things we'd done wrong.
They're definitely coming in.
Which is great, yeah, which is exactly what we were hoping for.
Been ignoring those.
Yeah, I bet. So that's forming. That helps kind of form some structure about what future projects to think about, and you had a whole list of them.
A lovely diagram.
Yeah, and you had a slide too. Yeah, we have CockroachDB, etcd. I have here messaging with Nats, stream processing with Heat, networking with Flannel, Calico, Weave, CNI, configuration etcd, RBC proxy with Linkerd, all these things that we write about all the time.
Yep.
Yeah. So how do you prioritize?
It's the way the CNCF is structured, it's really up to the TOC to decide which projects get in. We kind of have a process in place where anyone that is interested in becoming part of CNCF will go present to the TOC.
So if they're listening, people should actually get their voice in, shouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all on GitHub.
Yeah.
They could reach out to me or file an issue, and we'll get them scheduled. I think next week we have Pachyderm, scheduled, which is a unique little.
Pachyderm's cool.
Which is a unique little technology, but
are they in or no? They're one just a consideration.
They're just presenting to see if
cool.
to feel things out, to see if there's a fit. And so on.
The presenting to the TOC is really the first step.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like dating, let's go out.
So who's on the TOC?
So there's 9 folks. If you Google CNCF TOC, you'll get them.
Yeah,
people have heard of a lot of them, though.
Yeah.
It's folks like Solomon Hikes from Docker,
right.
Ben Heineman from Mesosphere, Brian Grant from Google.
Do you guys keep those minutes are open then, and you can get access to them?
Everything is open.
Okay.
Calls are all open every first and third Wednesday, 8 a.m. Pacific. Very simple.
Okay, cool. That's great. That's good information to share.
Yeah,
excellent.
And the mailing list is also open.
Right.
We encourage folks to contribute to it.
So the TOC then the TOC will then listen to the
the wider community.
Community.
There'll be discussion on the mailing list, and if the TOC feels comfortable, with the project, they'll ask them to put forth a formal proposal, which is a process for that, and then there'll be discussion around the proposal. Then it requires a 2/3 supermajority vote from the TOC to be accepted, and boom, there you go. You have your accepted project afterwards.
Yeah. The other big change coming down the pike is that we're adding a new category of earlier stage projects. And this was a little bit of a challenge we got into, where the first project in CNCF was Kubernetes, which is arguably one of the most successful, highest velocity, widely used projects of the last decade or so. And then the second one was Prometheus, which is also a fantastic project. I mean, it's just very widely used, has a huge level of adoption. We think this the format that it pulls things in can become an independent standard.
Right.
And those two projects set such a high bar that we had the fear that nothing else was going to meet it. and it creates a real issue, because if the only project that can come into CNCF is sort of already wildly successful on its own, then CNCF is not adding a ton of value. But on the other hand, the Technical Oversight Committee, those people feel strongly about their reputations and feel that their vote represents something. And so they don't want to necessarily support piddly little projects or sort of uncertain ones. So we're trying to thread that needle by creating this new category of projects that we're likely going to be calling Inception Stage. And that's hopefully is going to be a new process that gets approved in the next month or so. And what it does is allow less mature projects to join CNCF at an earlier stage. But unlike incubation projects, where when they're in, they're basically in. Maybe it'll take some number of years for them to complete the work, to graduate, but it's basically a sure thing. With the Inception Stage, it's set up so that every 12 months it requires a new vote of the TOC, and that vote can either maintain them at inception for another 12 months if things look promising. It can move them up to incubated, or even all the way to graduated. But if there's not a supermajority to keep them, they actually will leave the TOC. Will leave the CNCF.
How is the TOC chosen?
It's kind of complex.
Yeah, I mean, initially it was based on there was I think 5 from the original governing board was it 6 or 5? I'm trying to recall now.
It was 6.
It was 6. The initial governing board chose 6.
The initial CNCF governing board.
Yeah, that was the initial governing board when bootstrapped.
And those were the original members.
Yes, and the terms are pretty long. So the terms are either 2 or 3 years, depending how things were done. And then we allow the TOC itself the freedom to elect 2 more people. So from these initial 6 that were bootstrapped, they chose 2 more members. And then from kind of our burgeoning and incubating end user community, they were able to choose a representative to be on the TOC to represent the end user community interests. So that's how we got to our 9, and they're long terms. So we're talking 3-year, 2-year terms.
So what happens when the terms end?
Spots available for a new wave of.
Are they automatically grandfathered in, or is there term limits, or no? Or
there's term limits. It's all on the TOC GitHub. README.
I'm just curious on how these things work. Yeah.
Yeah, it's uniquely structured.
I would say though that it's somewhat, I wouldn't quite say unique, because really the model for it is the Linux Foundation, where you've had the vendors on the board, but then you have the technical advisory board of kernel developers, and they're elected every year at the kernel summit by the top kernel contributors. And then the chairperson of the tab serves on the Linux Foundation board. So I'd say that the Linux Foundation has really focused on this model of trying to separate technology decisions from business decisions, and we feel like this has really served us well over the last decade. And CNCF was emulating that. We had a little bit more of a challenge in that we were both bootstrapping it, and it's just a wider range of technology.
So we've covered a good bit of ground here. Anything in finale that you guys would like to share?
I'll just do 2 quick pieces that came up in my keynote. One, we're excited to be launching this Kubernetes Managed Service Provider program and a training and certification program that goes with this, and that'll include a free massively open online course, MOOC, about Kubernetes, and then folks can sign up for a training. It's going to be $199. It's $99 right now for people who sign up early. That can then lead you to become a certified Kubernetes professional. So for folks looking at this space, I think that's a neat opportunity. And then the other one is that we have drastically dropped the end user pricing, so that it is now, for a startup, the same cost as buying 2 tickets to CloudNativeCon, KubeCon. For a big company, it's the same as buying 5 tickets, and you get those tickets as well. And so our goal is to get a lot of companies that are using these technologies in different ways, and a real diversity of companies geographically, size of the company, what kind of business they're in, what clouds they're running on, what kind of metal, all those things, and to just have a lot more diversity around feedback in. And so if that's at all appealing to your listeners, I'd urge them to sign up.
I have 2 things also. One, like I mentioned before, OCI is getting really close to that 1 host. So if you have a stake in the container space, please get involved and give feedback before we kind of cement things. It would be greatly appreciated. And also, from today's keynote, we announced the events for next year for CNCF. So CloudNativeCon Europe is happening in March in Berlin, and also the one in North America will be in early December in Austin. So if you're interested in sponsoring, please do so early, since we sold out of sponsorships this year, and I'm assuming next year it's going to happen, and same with registration. So register early, submit your talk. CFP is open, at least for the one in Berlin, and just do it. Otherwise, we may be in another sold out situation. So hopefully not to jinx ourselves, but we'll see how things go.
Well, great. Well, thank you guys for participating, and Dan, thanks for joining us for Pancakes this morning.
Yeah, I hope we're going to be able to do the same thing in Berlin and Austin.
That'd be fun. Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys. We'd like to thank the Cloud Native Computing Foundation for sponsoring our podcast from CloudNativeCon in Seattle. Inspired by internet-scale computing, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation advances the development of cloud-native technology and services by creating a new set of common container technologies informed by technical merit and end-user value. You can learn more about the Cloud Native Computing Foundation at cncf.io.